first is President Jin of AIIB. He has been a real champion of nature's infrastructure. I don't think in my lifetime in these institutions I felt that someone grabbed onto something as engaged as he has done. Hopefully this will come out through his
Distinguished colleagues, it's a pleasure to send warm greetings for the launch of Unlocking Private Finance for Nature as Infrastructure. I thank our partners, the Paulson Institute, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and all other contributors for their collaboration and insight. When AIIB introduced the Nature as Infrastructure last year, our message was clear. Forests, wetlands, and reefs are not just a natural capital to be protected. They are productive systems that sustain economies and societies. Nature is infrastructure, and without it, all other infrastructure would lose its foundation to be built on. This new report takes the idea from vision to execution. It shows how governments and the private sector can work together through public-private partnerships for nature to mobilize finance at scale with long-term contracts, shared risk, and measurable outcomes. Unlocking private finance for nature requires an enabling environment, that is, supportive policies and restoration efforts that foster confidence that investments deliver real outcomes, as well as other technical support, such as data to verify results. Financial innovation has a role to play through guarantees, insurance, and biodiversity credits that make nature's value visible and investable. At AIIB, this work is central to our mission of financing infrastructure for tomorrow. We are integrating nature-based solutions into projects, supporting policy reform and connecting private capital to investments in restoration and resilience. I hope this report will serve as a practical roadmap for governments, development banks, and investors to align capital with the systems that sustain life, because nature is not a backdrop to progress. It is the foundation of it. Thank you very much, and I wish you a successful launch and productive discussions in Belém.
I don't think
the important launch of Unlocking Private Finance for Nature as Infrastructure, a public-private partnership. I will begin by recognizing the many partners who made this work possible: the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. A special thanks to President Jin of AIIB, whose leadership has been instrumental in advancing the concept of nature as infrastructure and in aligning public policy with private capital. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of Morphosis and Nature Finance, whose insight and analysis helped bring this report to life, and to thank all those across government, finance, and civil society who share a commitment to building a nature-positive global economy. It may seem unusual to launch a biodiversity finance report around a climate conference, but there's a good reason. The truth is, climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin. We can't fix climate without restoring nature. Yet today, climate action is far ahead, especially in finance. Climate receives over $1 trillion a year. Nature gets a fraction of that. If we're serious about solutions, we need to integrate biodiversity into every climate conversation, especially the ones about investment. That's why this report is being launched now, to help bridge these agendas and to drive integrated action. This report builds on a simple but powerful truth. Nature is not a luxury, it's our support system. Yet we're depleting it faster than it can regenerate. The economic case for protecting and restoring nature could not be clearer. Our prosperity depends on it. Over the past several years, we've made progress in recognizing nature's value. But recognition alone is not enough. We need to move from projects to platforms, from small-scale innovation to standardization and systemic investment. As the world confronts the overshoot of the 1.5 degrees centigrade target, nature as infrastructure will play an increasingly vital role in climate adaptation, protecting people, cities, and economies from worsening floods, heat, and drought. Together, this means treating nature as what it truly is, a critical infrastructure that underpins every economy. This report lays out a practical framework for doing just that. It shows how governments and financial institutions can use public-private partnerships for nature to mobilize private capital at scale. These partnerships apply the same proven tools we use for roads, bridges, and power grids, but this time for forests, wetlands, reefs, and other ecosystems that sustain life and livelihoods. The logic here is straightforward. If nature develops and delivers infrastructure-grade value, it should be financed, managed, and maintained as such. Governments must set the rules and provide the incentives that reward those who protect and restore nature and penalize those who destroy it. That is how markets shift, and that is how capital flows change. This report also highlights the powerful role of guarantees, insurance, and biodiversity credits, tools that can make nature investments bankable, measurable, and scalable. Used wisely, they align public ambitions with private expertise, creating new revenue streams for conservation and restoration. But none of this will happen on its own. Governments must lead. They must embed natural capital in national accounts and fiscal policy, reform harmful subsidies, and integrate nature into sovereign credit assessments. Multilateral development banks must act as honest brokers, helping countries build the enabling systems and standards that make nature investable. And the private sector must respond to those signals. Private investors put capital where they can earn a return. So if investing in nature is to happen at scale, governments must make it profitable to protect and restore nature and unprofitable to degrade it. That's how markets work, and that's how we turn good intentions into real investments. As we scale up this model, we must ensure that all new infrastructure, whether gray or renewable, is not built at the expense of nature. Proper planning and siting are essential to protect the very systems that protect us. The path forward is ambitious but achievable. The tools exist, the partnerships are forming. What is needed now is the will and the leadership to make nature central to our economic and financial systems. If we succeed, we will not only protect the planet's natural wealth, we will build a stronger, more resilient global economy. Thank you.
Yes, I think no one can doubt Hank Paulson's commitment to these issues, but it was very nice to have his call. Can we start? So I'm going to very briefly now present the report. Wonderful. So unlocking private finance for nature's infrastructure. So I think we all understand that we are not where we want to be. It is been an uphill battle to mobilize sufficient resources to combat the challenge of nature loss. And we here try to suggest that we should shift the lens a little bit, and we should think of nature as critical infrastructure. And I think the arguments that were made here, both from President Yin and Hank Paulson, are very much the arguments that I want to make. We have to look at these as productive assets, and using the infrastructure paradigm allows us to draw on all that experience that is in infrastructure finance. And we need to invest in nature, we need to manage nature, we need to make nature more resilient. And what we're suggesting here, that the public-private partnership model, both at the conceptual level, that we need to get private capital involved, we need to have a commitment from the public side, but also at the specific contractual structures that we find in PPPs will be useful. And of course, the very starting point is that we have to value nature properly and integrate that, as Hank Paulson was saying, not only in the assessment of individual projects, but also in the national accounts. We need to align policy, regulation, and fiscal frameworks. We need to use these complementary instruments of guarantees, insurance, biodiversity credits to make these projects bankable, and really move from viewing nature as a cost to be borne to being a valuable asset that should be financed. So, as I said, we don't just want to think of this public-private partnership at the conceptual level, but also thinking about the very specific contracts that are being used in infrastructure finance. And basically, the trick here is just to change the built, the B in these structures to restore, and then you have it pretty. So you have the DRO, the design, restore, and operate. The leaf collision would be a very good example of that. You have the design, restore, finance, operate. The TFFF that was launched a couple of days ago here in Belém is a very good example of that. We have a restore, operate, and transfer, and we are very happy to have Mariana, who she will have a chance to talk about this later, her wonderful project with Habitat Banks in Colombia, and actually spreading beyond Colombia as well. And maybe finally I'll mention an example that I think is kind of illustrating how one can think. So in Guangzhou, I was participating in the City Academy that the World Bank has in Guangzhou, and I was talking to some of the city administrators, and they described this public-private partnership that they run together with a insurance company and real estate developer, Vanke, a private one. And so they're restoring this old district of Guangzhou, and Vanke gets paid for lowering the temperature in the inner city, and particularly for taking out heat spikes. And when you think about what are the incentives for Vanke to be part of this, well, they are one of the largest owners of real estate in Guangzhou, and they also have life insurance. So the fact that you reduce the heat also a benefit. And I think that's exactly how you have to think about how to get these private actors involved in nature as infrastructure. We also have, I think, a very promising approach. We are working with two medium-sized. Don't worry too much about what the arrows and the boxes here. The message is that on lending to commercial banks, we are working with two commercial banks in China, Huzhou Bank and Bank of Jiangsu. They are very large by international standards, but in China they are medium-sized. And the key is that we provide loans to these banks, and these banks then finance sub-projects. They do so based on a taxonomy that now is the accepted taxonomy that the MDBs have agreed on for nature finance. We also benefit from Tencent buying nature-based carbon credits for projects underneath this. They also benefit from a national compensation scheme that China has based on this gross environmental product that they use to integrate natural capital into their government accounting. So I've seen this happen in other. Jean-Pierre here will also know, how this can be used for energy efficiency, for example, for women entrepreneurs. If you get this going, it's a massive, fast way of scaling up. And at each of these projects, you have to think about all the different sources of revenues that you can produce. And we are also working on trying to implement biodiversity credits using the principles that was established by the International Advisory Panel for Biodiversity. Mainly, no offsetting outside biomes or following only in jurisdictions, and focusing on the primary markets. So really getting that going could increase the bankability of these underlying projects as well. And we're doing a pilot in Huzhou, where we have working with the Huzhou Bank as well to get these biodiversity credits going. So, sorry. I just wanted to summarize. So the recommendations, again, for policymakers, MDBs, and for financial institutions is to use this public-private partnership for nature, both as the overriding framework, where you really emphasize that the government, the public side, need to be there in order to get the private sector to provide the regulation, provide compensation schemes, and the like. Then you can you need to build the operating system for nature finance, which includes, of course, accounting frameworks that really involves nature finance or valuation of nature. And we need to do that both at the individual company level, but also at the national level. And of course, this is all about scale. So we need to find all the different tools that we can use to get scale on this. And again, these very specific contracts that we have worked with for a long time in infrastructure finance can be applied to nature, and we gave you some examples. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to shift. Okay. Now I'm going to shift from being a speaker and a protagonist to being a very impartial moderator here. And we have a wonderful panel. I want to invite the panel to come along. Do we have? I think there is this wonderful here. So I'm going to start inviting Albert Park, my homonym, my colleague from Asian Development Bank. We work a lot together, and also our institutions work a lot together. We are the largest co-financier of the Asian Development Bank. The next is Mariana Sarmiento from Terrazos. I already said a little bit about your very exciting venture, and you'll have some chance to say something more about it. And finally, Harvey Locke. There you are, Harvey Locke, who has a long track record in conservation, and the co-chair of, or vice chair maybe it is, of Nature Positive, a big with a lot of experience from conservation, from very concrete projects all around the world, but maybe particularly in the US and Canada. So I wanted to start maybe with you, Albert. I mentioned this challenge of getting private capital. I mean, this is in a way the holy grail. When we need to get private capital into nature, is probably the most difficult thing that we are facing when it comes to climate and nature finance. So what do you think are the keys? What are the key barriers, and how should we overcome them?
Thanks, Eric. And I want to start by really thanking AIIB and Eric in particular for his leadership on really conceptualizing nature as infrastructure, which I think has been really influential and useful for a lot of organizations. We also have just launched a report called Unlocking Nature for Development. And I sent out I tried to distribute flyers to the group, so please take a look. It really, I think, complements and shares the same spirit of the recommendations in this really terrific report by AIIB and various partners. And we try to do in our, I think I'm okay, in our report is really first emphasize that investing in nature is a very high return activity. So it's not a message for environmental ministers, it's a message for finance ministers and leaders of countries. And we have an estimate that 75% of economic output in Asia Pacific depends on sectors that are either moderately or heavily dependent on nature. And the other message of the report is kind of one of optimism and feasibility, that many of the pieces we need to really scale up investment in nature exist. They're not reaches, but they do require strengthening, what Eric describes as the operating system for nature finance. And we also, in our report, describe an operating system that has three key components. One is governance, one is policies, and then the third is data. And so I thought maybe I'd say a couple of words about these things to amplify some of the messages in this report. So, as an economist, you say, what are the barriers or why are things not happening? We usually try to think, why do markets fail? And clearly, for nature investments, there's often a failure due to different types of externalities and the lack of clarity in property rights, which lead to less than optimal solutions. And I also think that kind of lack of information can create failures too. So even if you have rules, if you have no way to agree on what's actually happening and what the benefits and harms are, then it's actually hard to really scale up any meaningful economic activity. So those are the ones I would focus on. If we think about governance, one thing we emphasize is the importance of environmental laws. And really, in our research fund, we've done a lot of research on climate change and many types of financial flows and investments. And one thing that is very consistent is when the government sets a clear policy direction, the private sector really responds, and you see a lot more investment and willingness to invest if the government sets clear policy directions. And one aspect of this is really important because, if we go back to Ronald Coase's, Nobel Prize work, if you can really clarify who has the rights to different types of property rights, then the market can solve a fair amount of the problems. And so for nature, one aspect of this is to make sure that indigenous groups have clear claims over their resources and the natural capital that belongs to their communities. And that will strengthen their hand in making claims or demanding payments for various infringements on that. So then if we turn to policies, I think the goal of policies really are to create value also, because we know that for things like carbon pricing, if there's a carbon price, and it's now hopefully a global carbon market, then this also provides a way to capture value, which is very complementary to investment in nature. But even creating just accountability rules from a policy perspective can also deliver value and create activity. So for instance, I've always been impressed in China's use of gross environmental product as actually now measure and are going to scale up nationally based on their estimate of the value of ecosystem services in any jurisdiction. If some other jurisdiction does something that harms the value in the neighboring jurisdiction, they're legally liable to compensate in real money that jurisdiction. And obviously that requires many pieces, but one is the law, the policy that requires the compensation. And of course, you need the data to measure it in a way that both sides will agree upon. And so I think that's a good example of the kind of things that need to happen to make market works. I think, nature as infrastructure is a very useful concept, but I appreciated that in the report, when they talk about PPP, they do recognize that there's a whole gradient of activities. Sometimes it can just be only public, like in a pure public good framework, like flood protection. I think the government has to play the Reed rule. But then there can go to the other end where it's almost the private sector could deal with it by itself if it had the enabling environment that can support market activity. And then in between that, I think we need to think about what are the market failures and what are the roles of the government or MDBs to maybe help in some of the de-risking activities or capturing the parts of value that should matter to society and to the economy, but are not being realized. So finish with just one example of a project ADB has been supporting, and that's in the South Dongting Lake in China, which is a wetland ecosystem restoration project. And one key feature of the project is there's an eco compensation fund that has been set up that draws on some of the revenues that actually come from the ecosystem services, from tourism revenue, from park entry fees and other things. And it recycles some of that with some extra money, I think, to then compensate farmers, fishermen, to make sure that their practices are sustainable in terms of how they're doing their agriculture and their aquaculture. And so that may not be enough to capture all of the benefits. One reason we're investing in that project too, it's a key point on a whole migration route of many birds in Asia. And so it's part of a broader regional project to do this. It's called the Regional Flywheel Initiative to support various points along this migration change. And so you can see here, it's kind of complicated, but there are ways to activate markets and reduce costs and make it more financially sustainable and bring in the private sector, even while recognizing the public interest at stake. So maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think the last example you gave there of even trying to think of these flyways as nature's infrastructure, these sequence of wetlands or landing spots for the birds, I think is something we want to explore as a real investable project. But that's it's going to take a little bit of work to make that happen, but I think it's worth fighting for. Mariana, you are running a PPP. I mean, there's a very important role for the government in your program. You mentioned indigenous groups or communities that take care of these nature assets. That's very much at the core of your model. So maybe you can describe it a little bit and reflect on the PPP concept there.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mariana Sarmiento. I'm from Colombia, and I run an organization called Terrazos, which is a private company. So about 7 years ago, we started to bet on a model, on a PPP model, based on the biodiversity compensation regulation in Colombia, but also a watershed compensation regulation that we have. So I'm going to explain it just so that everybody understands and why we think it's an infrastructure model, but it's also a very successful infrastructure model, both for nature, for investors, and for local communities. So what we do is we identify where there are going to be a lot of impacts from infrastructure projects. Yeah, in Colombia, we have a compensation regulation where if you impact 1 hectare of a very threatened ecosystem, you will have to compensate at least 10. So the policy effectively makes companies internalize that cost. So where demand is concentrated, we'll go and look for strategic sites. And we engage with local landowners or communities, create either a partnership. Sometimes there will be land acquisition, and we set up the whole project for 30 years. right? So it's very much like a road or a toll road, which is for 30 years, or a solar project, which is for 30 years. These are 30-year concessions. So we design, then we build, there's a restoration component to it, and then we maintain. And the way that it works is that, let's say there's 100 hectares, so 100 biodiversity units or credits, and these credits are bought by the companies that need to compensate. Now we have some companies that are buying it just for contribution purposes. The revenue is collected in the first 10 years approximately, and a percentage of that revenue automatically goes into a sinking endowment. So we are effectively created a financial instrument to maintain the infrastructure. So if we draw the parallel, when we're talking about infrastructure that needs to be built and maintained, there's a design, there's a build, and there's a maintenance process. And we need to find a way to pay for it for those 30 years. So that's what we're doing. And right now, so just some numbers. For every dollar that we spend on building and investing in these, we're being able to leverage 20 times that amount in private capital coming in from purchasing of biodiversity units. And this is all being enabled by the policy. Some reflections in terms of what do we need to have more of these structures. I think one critical aspect is durability. If there is no long-term requirement on conservation projects, we won't be able to build these like infrastructure. So in the compensation world, in the US, in Australia, in Colombia, in the UK, the minimum is 30 years. So that automatic puts you in an infrastructure context. Otherwise, the risk that we're going to have is that we're going, all this money that we're all talking about, it's going to be invested 5 years from now. We don't know what's going to happen with those sites. So we really need to incorporate in the rulemaking, whether it's regulatory or contractual, the durability aspect of it. It's fundamental. The other thing that I would say is private sector response to obligations. Yeah, so whether it's regulatory or contractual. And our most successful cases are precisely because they're derived from it. Some of it from government regulation, but others from contractual regulation from the application of Performance Standard 6. And for all of you here that are part of the MDBs, you have a lot of power. You have a lot of market-making power. And right now, we're doing the delivery of a Performance Standard 6 nature positive requirement on a large infrastructure port, and we're enabling a whole landscape worth of long-term infrastructure. And why is this so critical? Because when you build infrastructure, large-scale infrastructure, so Asia, for example, lots of airports are being built. Lots of ports are being built. When you create one of these anchor infrastructure projects, roads come, the transmission line comes, solar plants come, there becomes a huge opportunity to create these types of habitat banks that are just exponential in terms of the benefit that they can create. So again, for every dollar you invest in building these things, you can leverage up to 20x in private capital for 30 years. I don't think there are very few conservation models that allow this. And you said something about property rights. One of the conditions of success, or one of the key things that has made this habitat banking model very successful, is that once somebody buys that unit, liability is transferred. And that's fundamental, because at the same time, these models with bio credits, with units, they also de-risk environmental investments for the private sector who doesn't know how to do this. So understanding what that asset is and how that asset is transferred from one to another and how liability is also transferred is also a part of success for these models.
Thank you, Mariana. I think it's a wonderful illustration of many of the things that we have been saying. You talk about the long horizon, working with the local populations, using the obligation of the private sector to make this work. Let me turn to Harvey. So we use the word conservation here, and you're one of the heroes of the conservation movement, but we are trying to take it beyond just preserving something. It's really thinking of them as productive assets that we need to invest in, need to manage, need to make more resilient. Can you speak from your experience, global experience, but also from your US-Canada experience?
Thank you. I am so excited that these big MDBs are thinking about nature. And here's the simple proposition. Nature has value. Second simple proposition, we have a gargantuan, gigantic, enormous market failure that nature has no financial value unless you cut it down, dig it up, catch it from the ocean, dam it, something. You have to kill nature to make it valuable. Or you can now make money if you restore nature that has been damaged, but you can't make money keeping nature intact. This is a completely idiotic market failure. I'm sorry, but it couldn't be stupider. I was asked to come into serve the government of Canada for 6 months as special advisor to the chief negotiator for the Global Biodiversity Framework in Montreal for Canada. And I was assigned, please figure out how to increase private finance going into the Global Biodiversity Framework. Answer, you can only do it for Target 2, which is restoration. You can't do it for Target 1 or Target 3, which is the 30 by 30 goal or the stop the loss of intact nature goal. Whoa, same with climate finance. If there's additionality, it's no good. Well, intact nature doesn't have additionality because it's intact. Scientifically, it's beyond doubt that the most important thing to hang on to is intact nature. Restoration comes second. So I set myself the task, and with the happy support of what's called the Yellowstone to Yukon Intact Nature Finance Project, support from the Moore Foundation, how do we solve that basic market failure? And what's so fun about it is one of the places we arrived at was infrastructure, but through completely different means than what's been discussed here. So I'll give you an example. Imagine an aqueduct, the world's largest aqueduct. It's so big that it provides half of the water that waters one of the world's greatest food bread baskets. Imagine that piece of infrastructure sitting there with no one ensuring that it continues to function, with no one ensuring that it's looked after through time, and no one being insured against the risk of that failing. It's unimaginable. Well, guess what? There's something called the flying river that comes out of the Amazon rainforest, which is exactly that, except it happens to be in the sky. And it is the water infrastructure on which the biggest economies of South America completely depend. It's what the city of Sao Paulo depends on for about a lot of its water supply. And it is at risk if the Amazon forest is cleared more than 20%. The Amazon forest is cleared as to 17% today. Okay, so we don't need to think about the Amazon as a biodiversity problem, as a climate change problem, as a loss of indigenous cultures who depend on the rainforest problem. If you clear more than 20% of the Amazon rainforest, you can go to many pavilions, the planetary pavilion just over here, and see this. It risks shutting down this thing called the flying river and the whole system transitioning to a savanna. That means that this huge breadbasket in which all of the largest financial institutions in the world are exposed, because everyone owns a piece of the giant food buyers, everyone owns a piece of the giant transportation companies, and the Brazilian and Argentine economies are very, very big. China gets most of its soybeans from there. Okay, we're talking about something, to use the Hank Paulson phrase, too big to fail. We have to hang on to this. Therefore, we must reverse engineer a means to hang on to it. So we arrived at this idea of an insurance policy for the Amazon. What if you said that this infrastructure needs to be retained as water infrastructure? Could you create a fund and an insurance scheme that people would pay into an insurance program? They would be compensated in the event of a parametric trigger if it went down. But it would be like what's called the whole life insurance policy, where some of the money goes into the insurance and some of it goes into the investment for more money in the future, right? This is common life insurance stuff. Imagine if you did that where, say, half the money, notionally, went into traditional safe insurance level stuff, and the other half was invested in keeping the forest standing. You'd reduce the risk of loss on the insurance, just like your heat loss and life insurance example in Guangzhou. And you would create an enormous fund that has a purpose, and that purpose is to maintain the water infrastructure that is the Amazon rainforest. And you'd have to do that by maintaining the hydrology in the rivers, because the forest is a function also of the rivers, not just the atmospheric river. You'd need to focus on the whole Amazon biome as an indispensable piece of the financial infrastructure of the earth, which it absolutely is. And you could do this, imagine it being done in the self-interest of all those big interests. And the second part that's really interesting when it comes to MDBs is right now there's a European Central Bank report just came out that says that the sovereign debt cost of the Andean countries that depend on this flying river from Brazil is going to go up between $15 and $25 billion on account of the risk of the loss of the flying river. So imagine instead of those countries paying that on their debt, that money was diverted into stopping the problem. If we had that kind of money, we'd be saving the Amazon. So we have to kind of reimagine the finance chessboard with a view to saying water infrastructure is the atmospheric river. It's a flying aqueduct, if you will. There's no reason on earth we can't do this. And then if you did the market or the policy directions that you're all advocating for, because if you take Brazil, for example, Brazil's crop insurance regime is annual. They work with an insurance company that covers 75%, they cover 75% of the premium, the farmers buy the insurance, they put in 25%, that's an annual policy. Well, okay, that's crop insurance. Great. Well, there's 1 year of catastrophic loss on account of the flying river stopping. Then the insurance company is not obliged to renew the policies, and Brazil becomes the reinsurer of the whole thing. And they were already experiencing a catastrophic decline in revenues. They're already experiencing a huge amount of hunger. We could avoid all that if we just do what is being suggested here and think about financing it as infrastructure. So I'm really excited about this reconception. When Eric told me about this report, I was just clicking my heels going, yahoo! Somebody's arrived at it for the same reason, but by a different road. And that tells me that we've got a good idea. So if this idea is of interest, it's something I'm pursuing vigorously with the team. Thanks.
So Harvey, thank you so much. And you actually don't know this, but our next flagship report that we launch in February is all about this. So it's about, so we look at the flying river, we have data allowing us to look at, where a drop of water comes from and where it ends up. And 43% of the flying rivers come from Brazil. We can do it country by country. It goes, of course, this flying river benefits the agriculture and so on and so much more in Latin America. But more importantly, perhaps, it benefits Africa, it benefits India, and even reaches to some extent to China. And then if you combine that with the Congo River Basin, the Indonesia, these are the three key parts to the whole hydrological cycle you're talking about. And it's that we have to think about as the global public good. that we have to pay for them. So thank you. I'll invite you for the next session as well. Okay, we have a few minutes left. Please, questions. Naoki. You can see Naoki has she has the scars from her battle for global public goods.
Yeah.
Naoki.
Yeah, I'm the director Center for Global Commons because it's not only public, it's also private.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that I cannot agree more with the fact that Harvey said and also Hank Polo said, because this COP to me is a planetary science meet the economics.
Yeah.
The planetary science basically said we were totally out of the balance of the natural system.
Yeah.
And in this Anthropocene, we have to internalize every externalities into the market system. Otherwise, we will continue to erode our fundamental life supporting system. The question maybe that Eric is posing is how to do it, but so that so we all know how to need to fix this market system, but this project by project approach has so much of the limitation.
Yeah.
So my question maybe for Eric and then Harvey is how you can really transform this market failure thing into the actual step rather than just doing project by project. So that yesterday that we had a session with the finance ministers, and then we actually discussed that the new climate finance report done by NICS. But one of the issue is natural capital. And you also mentioned valuing the natural capital is not good enough. How we can really transform it into the financial statement. So that is something the next step, I think. And if you have any ideas and your roadmap, I would very much appreciate it.
Wonderful. So I'll take, I think, 2 more questions, and then we will answer your question there.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to have the outline, especially from, ADB and AIIB. I'm Charles Bedford. I'm with the Carbon Growth Partners. We're an investment company in the carbon markets. So I'm looking around the world, scouring for investable carbon projects. And from the private sector's perspective, you have to have very clear regulatory systems or lending requirements. And what we're seeing is the element of some of the regulatory systems in countries like Colombia, like the US, now Britain. But we're not really seeing much coming out of the development banks in terms of the requirement under Performance Standard 6 to offset the impacts. Do you think that is a market failure, or is there a problem there with that final part of the mitigation hierarchy? Is that not being required? Can it be required? Can we create at the lending level, at a macro global level, as opposed to country by country, a requirement to have mitigation in place?
Thank you. Okay.
Hello, my name is Sophie Punte. I'm a founder and CEO of LifeLinks. I'm looking in a similar way as you do, but looking at transport as a critical asset in supply chains. And my question to you is, my theory of change is that if you put transport in the context of supply chains, you can leverage the capital and interest from insurers, from companies that depend on it. And my question is perhaps to you more, Harvey. Could you apply the same logic? So you put nature, like the flying river, much more explicitly in the context of the supply chains that they serve, and therefore get the economic partners that depend on those supply chains to co-invest. Whereas right now, it's too often presented as an isolated thing somewhere in Brazil that people feel very disconnected to when they buy whatever coffee or whatever products in Europe, for example. Thank you.
Okay, maybe you can start, Harvey, and I think all 3 you can choose, and then we'll
So in response to the last question, absolutely that's the idea. So if you're buying food from this area, this is your problem. If you're investing in a company that buys food from this area, this is your problem. This is not a global commons problem in the sense of it's an undifferentiated concern for everyone. As Naoko says, there's also the private dimension of the global commons. This is absolutely, every large investor in the world has a piece of this risk. Right now, they're doing absolutely nothing about it, and they're carrying an unpriced risk of enormous significance, which would be far cheaper for them to mitigate through this mechanism. So that's how, just thinking about how pieces move around. Noko's point about nature on the balance sheet, super, super important. So there's I think Peter Backer once said the accountants can save the world, which is a very funny comment, but it goes like this. There's something called SABC. It's how governments keep national accounts. And there's an international standard. And at their December meeting of the group that sets international national accounting standards, there's a conversation about putting tangible natural assets, allowing countries to report that on their balance sheets. If this gets widespread adoption, it changes the creditworthiness of a bunch of countries that are perceived as poor right now, but who are nature rich. It gives a framework to underpin and support what everyone's been talking about at this level. And it starts valuing natural capital. And if we can get that used and implemented and valued, the fundamental failure, and this is, Noko, I'm just going to build on what you said. We perceive right now that at the worst state, nature is a luxury, a competing interest with economic activity, and economic activity comes first. Social concerns come second, and nature comes third, okay? That's one way of looking at it. Then you have the sustainable development paradigm, which is the Venn diagram of the three concentric rings, where you're looking for the sweet spot of the intervention of both. Both are wrong, flat wrong. The way the world works is like this. That's the Earth and everything within the Earth system, planetary boundaries, everything. This was said in the videos. Inside that is human society, which is wholly dependent on that other system functioning well. And inside that is the economy, inside the human society, and the economy exists for only one reason, to serve humans. It has no life of its own, and yet we talk like the economy can't afford this. It's a form of insanity. It's like the economy must be able to serve humans, and the humans must live within the Earth system, or we're all baked. It's really, really simple. That's an iron proof, by the way. There is no logical way out of that. Can the Earth exist without humans? You bet it did for several billion years. Can humans exist without a modern economy? You bet we did for hundreds of thousands of years. So we've got to get our conceptual framework right. And that was really interesting to hear both the video presentations say, nature is the foundation of all economic activity, and then there's highly dependent on nature direct things, but the whole works depends on nature. And we're killing nature right now. And nature in the climate system, one second, if you read the UNFCCC, what it says is this is about the stability of the climate system, which is the interaction of the atmosphere, the biosphere, the geosphere, and the hydrosphere. That's nature, by the way. And the entire climate conversation is about nature because of how resilient we are, how adaptable we are. If you read the conventions, that's what it says. So this work that these people are doing is exciting because we can turn the corner.
Thank you very much. No, so can I say also, so I'll just give the floor in a moment to Mariana and Albert, but just on your, so it's about risk, and I agree completely that there's a lot of unpriced risk in this. But even if you did the very simple exercise of pricing that water that goes through this hydrological cycle, we just apply any water tariff, you will be able to prove that there is an enormous debt to Brazil, to the Amazon, and to the Congo Basin, to Indonesia. Somehow we need to find a way of making companies and organizations pay for this. Mariana, do you want to come in on any of the questions?
So maybe a little bit on the kind of the supply chain case. I think in principle we all agree that all the companies that depend on ecosystem services should be paying for nature restoration and nature conservation, but they don't. No, but they don't. And I think in other sectors we have figured out ways, because humans don't save for the future automatically. We're actually really bad at it, right? And that's why so many people don't save for when they get older. And the way that we've solved it is because there's mandatory contributions to pension funds, or there is a mandatory insurance that you need to buy when you take out your loan. Or so I think we need to come to the reality that companies, because they're short term enterprises, are probably not going, very few will begin to invest in landscapes because of supply chain risk. So what we're working on right now in terms of use cases for biocredits and for landscape conservation is working with financial institutions that are lending to these within these landscapes, and seeing how we can embed an automatic contribution to the watershed. So it's automatic. They don't have to think about it, and we're delivering the results outcome based on an outcome based principles. So I think we need to, we've the infrastructure parallel is extremely useful because nature is infrastructure. So the financing models are there, but also the public policies to enable public-private partnerships have already been designed. But I think we also need to look at regulation regarding pension funds, regarding healthcare systems, where we've been able to figure out, it's already been done, how to get people to automatically pay for things that in the short term they won't. Like, you ask people, hey, will you invest in your health insurance premium? No, I'd rather spend the money on a nice car. So those tools exist. We need to, we've been really, the nature space has been really slow in adapting those tools into the system.
Albert, thanks. I almost want to see my time to Harvey because I enjoy hearing him talk so much, as we all do. Thanks so much. So I want to kind of get at these questions raised about scaling up beyond projects, and also is there a market failure, and are MDBs also part of that failure? Which it's a fair question. And I like to be optimistic. Actually, we saw yesterday the numbers on MDB financing on climate, and it's been increasing very fast, and we're on target to meet our climate financing goals, ambitious ones for 2030. And I can tell you at ADB, we're really focusing on working much better with the private sector to leverage more private sector finance to understand better what are the constraints. And we're doing a lot of reorganization, in fact, to have a more one ADB effort of all departments to think what is their part. So we understand how important it is to get to the point where the private sector actually is really interested in participating in the finance. I think there are a lot of pieces here that still need work to develop to be systematic at a national level to, I think, attract lots of finance. But I don't think we're as far off as we necessarily think we are. So, one thing at ADB, we work a lot with countries at the upstream level on things like developing the regulatory environment for public-private partnership schemes, and I'm sure we'll be incorporating finance. And then we also do a lot of work on disaster risk assessments, and disaster risk finance will be, I think, increasingly an important part going forward. To address some of these data issues, we're creating data platforms that are very granular at a spatial level and bring all sorts of big data together to try to understand in a deeper way both the nature and interaction of different aspects of disaster risk management and climate risks, which hopefully will provide data support for ambitious efforts. I think to scale up these efforts at national levels requires really a very strong commitment to natural capital accounting in national systems. And so we're working with countries like the Philippines and Indonesia. I think China is making good progress on its own to have a fully national system. But just an example of what we do in the Philippines is we have a pilot project where we're taking one of the major river valleys and then taking a landscape approach and trying to really understand all of the ecosystem services that are part of that ecosystem, and to try to think of different ways that we can value those services using multiple assumptions, multiple types of big data, small data, survey data, et cetera. But the point is so that they can understand where the values are, and then it can drive finance solutions. But also, if we do that for one river valley and train the government on how to do that, then they can do it for the second and third river valleys, and eventually have full coverage of their country and really understand at a national level what the value is of nature, at least to the extent that we have measurement tools to do so. And I think those kind of efforts will pay huge dividends going forward in terms of thinking about how specific projects can configure, how we can scale up ambition not at a project by project level, but a whole landscape level for whole river shed systems, et cetera. And so I think those are some of the things we're doing. This year ADB is leading the MDB Nature Group, and there was a session yesterday. I think you were there as well, and so I think there was good project on thinking about how do you develop metrics for results. And it's about the data that underlies it, and it's really painstaking effort. You need to consult with a wide variety of groups, but I think that's the right direction. At the end of the day, I think there probably will be trigger points where you see big jumps if we just keep plugging away at these very core kind of issues about regulation, about data, and about policy.
Yeah, thank you. We are coming towards the end here, but I also want to respond to I think we can do this at the level of individual projects. Give you one example. We were working with a local authority in Inner Mongolia, and they wanted to use part of a wetland for managing floods. And we said, we'll help you with this, but we'll also apply a natural capital valuation model on top of our cost-benefit analysis. And when we show them what this wetland contributed in terms of carbon capture, air purification, water purification, cross-pollination, all those ecosystem services, and we went back to them and they said, we want to think about restoring the entire wetland. And to me, that was a project that went sort of from a very targeted nature-based solution to a nature-based infrastructure thinking. And we spoke about, we do things at project level, and I think what I talked about earlier, using the commercial banks to really scale up at the project level, and a lot of small projects that we can't deal with as MDBs. But we have another tool which is also very powerful, which I think is the policy-based financing. We, since last year, have been allowed to do policy-based financing for climate. And we did our first standalone. We had done several with ADB and World Bank before, but our first standalone anywhere was here in Brazil. 2 weeks ago, our board approved a financing of 1 billion to the Brazilian government. It has some traditional climate policy elements, so carbon markets. It has works on involving private investors through the Eco-Invest system, but it has a very clear nature component, and that's we are supporting a framework for managing mangroves in Brazil. Very much a very important piece of the nature as infrastructure story. Finally, and it is something I want to emphasize, and I think it goes to several points that have been made here. The final point or the final part of that program is a health program. We're a planetary health program looking at the carbon footprint of the health sector, looking at the climate resilience, having early warning systems for air pollution, for heat, and so on. We need to bring in also, I think, into the picture the human health dimension of this, that a lot of this, this is how this started in China. It was about air pollution and the whole environmental movement, the climate movement, and what now the ecological civilization movement is, all came from air pollution. I think we need to think much more about the human health impact of what we are doing to nature. And then we had to add all up and see what do we need to pay for this and how do we get the money. Thank you so much for staying with us, and very much thank you to my panelists. Mike.